Hello, and welcome to Around the Political World with John Rothman. I am your host, John Rothman. If you're a fan of the show, make sure to hit the follow button on the top right of Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening at this very moment. When you hit follow, leave a review or share an episode with a friend. It helps other people discover the show, keeps us going, and would like to remind you each and every day it expands our base. The Supreme Court is front and center. We have to talk about the decision this morning, an important decision, an 8-1 decision, and of course it was Clarence Thomas who dissented, having to do with domestic violence. Should someone who commits domestic violence acts be allowed to own a gun? And the Supreme Court, in a fantastic decision in my mind, said no. Now, Clarence Thomas argues that the Second Amendment really should make it possible for anybody to own a weapon. And of course, you and I know that isn't true. But it is important to note that there will be continued activity by the Supreme Court dealing with guns. There's no question that a lot of decisions are yet to come from the court in the years ahead, dealing with the question of any kind of gun control. I look forward to that. I hope we're moving in the right direction. But of course, there is a second major decision coming that we have to talk about. That is the question of presidential blanket immunity. Donald Trump made a statement that was intriguing to me. He said a president needs blanket immunity, and he cited as an example Harry Truman and the dropping of the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The implication of what Donald Trump said is that Harry Truman could have been brought to court for murder. I guess that's what he meant. But doesn't he understand the Constitution? Oh, what a silly question. Of course he doesn't understand the Constitution. The president, as commander-in-chief, makes certain decisions that are tough, and no one expects those decisions to be questioned in terms of a court case. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki have no relevance to what the Supreme Court is deciding now. The question is, should a president have blanket immunity? And I want to raise this with you in a very serious way. Here we are in the month of June, and we are approaching the anniversary of a discussion on June 23rd, 1972, between Richard Nixon and H.R. Bob Haldeman. And the question had to do with the cover-up of Watergate. I would suggest to you that the argument could be made vigorously, under Donald Trump's reasoning, that what Haldeman and Nixon did that day in suggesting the diversion of the FBI and the CIA from any investigation because of national security, the Bay of Pigs thing, as Richard Nixon often referred to it, would have prevented Watergate from really coming to the fore. Richard Nixon would have gotten away with what was done on June 23rd. The smoking gun tape would not have been relevant. If Donald Trump and his position is upheld by the court, it will mean that a president is above the law. This is something we need to think about, not just in the context of Donald Trump, but in the context of what happened back in 1972, 73, and 74. The idea that Richard Nixon would have gotten away with it if the Supreme Court were to rule the way Donald Trump wants them to rule is something we should all be thinking about. I want to raise another issue relative to Donald Trump, and that has to do with the fact that he is talking about revenge, openly revenge. Remember, one of the things that Richard Nixon was really nailed for was the idea of an enemies list, the idea of weaponizing his Justice Department, of being able to proceed as if a president were above the law. What happened in the case of Watergate was that Nixon was proven to be not above the law. Although he said in the David Frost interviews that if the president does it, it's not illegal. Well, you and I know that isn't true. But it could be true if the Supreme Court were to uphold the idea that Donald Trump is promulgating. And that is the idea of blanket immunity. When will the decision come down? It could be later today. It could be next week. But remember, the court now, after today, will not reconvene with decisions until next Wednesday. At least that's what we're told. The debate is on Thursday night. And that means that this decision on blanket immunity may not come down until after the debate, but if it comes down before the debate, you can be certain it will be the subject of great discussion. We hang on a critical moment in history. Is the President of the United States above the law? And should a former President of the United States be able to take the kinds of actions which Donald Trump claims he would do? Let me be crystal clear, so there is no ambiguity about this. What happens with this court decision will have an effect on presidential power, well, forever. So let's hope the Supreme Court does the right thing. And let's consider the fact that there are only two justices on the court who might uphold presidential blanket immunity, Alito and Thomas. Based on what Clarence Thomas did today in the decision dealing with whether or not someone should be able to own a gun or purchase a gun or have a gun who has committed the kind of offense which is so clearly and patently dangerous, the idea of someone who is an offender, someone who is able to own a gun, the court said no. Let's hope they say no again, this time dealing with the question of presidential blanket immunity. It will take courage for the court to do that, and certainly it will be a blow to Donald Trump, but it will be a strengthening of the American justice system. So we wait patiently for what will be a historic decision by the United States Supreme Court. Thanks for tuning into another episode of Around the Political World. Make sure to follow along. Let me know your thoughts on the show by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts and sharing an episode with a friend or colleague. You can interact with me on Facebook or on LinkedIn. And I especially want to thank the wonderful producer of this podcast, Gogo Zoger. Of course, the weekend is here. I won't be back until Monday, but we'll be watching the news avidly to see what the Supreme Court does, if anything, before we record another segment. Have a great weekend, and I will see you on Monday, right here on Around the Political World with John Roth.